my name's Alex, this is Tank Tested, and you're looking at my entry into the nano aquascaping competition at the Aquatic Experience. I chose this layout because I wanted to challenge myself to solve a very specific problem. How do you get a complex and fragile carpet of plants, like the one you see here, into a tank that can be judged in less than 24 hours? Typically, moving a carpet destroys it. This video is about how I chose to overcome that challenge. So let's go back a few weeks. This is the backbone of my aquascape. It's made of rock, plastic, metal, and silicone. Together, they form a structure that I can grow a carpet on and move as one unit into a new tank, simply by sliding it into the tank. Key to the structure was this white plastic. It was a 2-foot by 4-foot sheet of light diffuser that I was able to cut up to build the structure for this scape. It supports not only the base, but it also secures every single rock in this scape. Because it's just a grid, I had to fill in all the holes in the base with silicone. It's not the most efficient use of silicone, but it did the job. You can also see here the stainless steel mesh I used. I used this mesh as a retaining wall to hold the substrate and plants and prevent landslides when I had to drive the scape across the country and eventually fill it in Chicago. In sections like this, the substrate would have absolutely collapsed without the mesh standing in its way. And then you've got the rock itself. This material is sold as maple leaf stone, and its look defines this scape. It's a crumbly, porous, lightweight stone with veins of quartz that give it a pop of white. I got the stone from Rachel O'Leary. Now, if you don't know who Rachel is, take the time to subscribe to her channel. She is one of the most generous and knowledgeable aquarists out there. She also lent me this tank. It's identical to the ones used in the competition. Without it, I wouldn't have known the exact size I needed to build my scape. So, for many reasons, Rachel is the reason why this scape looks the way it does. For the substrate, I used flooville stratum. It comes in relatively large pellets, and I found that it holds up pretty well against steep slopes as long as you support it, which was my main concern with this scape. As for the plants, I used Monte Carlo for the bottom and the slope going up to the top layer, and then I used dwarf baby tears for the back section of the top level. To fill this scape, I broke off small sections of Monte Carlo and dwarf baby tears. Each stem had around 10 leaves on it, and I planted them individually into the substrate. These plants in the foreground are Monte Carlo. They're small, but they're significantly larger than dwarf baby tears. As we pan along, you can start to see the much smaller dwarf baby tears in the background. This creates an artificial sense of depth. Because the Monte Carlo and dwarf baby tears are the same color and shape, we also assume that they're the same size. But because the dwarf baby tears are so much smaller, we assume that they are much further back. This creates a forced sense of depth, and we assume the tank must be much deeper than it actually is. You can see here how densely I've done my initial planting. I didn't use that many plants, but because I divided them up into individual stems, they've covered a huge area. With the dwarf baby tears that I had left over, I planted the very top of my aquascape. This wasn't critical, but I think it brought the tank together. At this point, we're 5 weeks out from the aquatic experience. I like to grow out my aquascapes using the dry start method, which means that my plants are exposed to humid air rather than submerged in water. This system exposes fledgling plants to much more CO2 and allows them to grow a dense root structure. But this system does require the plants be watered several times a day. Unfortunately, I was traveling for 3 of the 5 weeks prior to the aquatic experience, which meant that I needed to come up with a system that didn't require me to water my plants. This is the system I came up with. It worked okay. I put the scape in a large holding tank, and I filled that tank with about 1.5 inches of water. That was too much water, and I'll show you why. Here you can see that the Monte Carlo at the bottom of my scape was completely submerged, which meant that those plants didn't grow in as quickly as everything else. But I filled the tank this deep for 2 reasons. First, I needed an aeration stone, because the top of the tank was sealed, which meant that no air was getting into the scape. For plants to grow, they need CO2, and this air stone provided air from the outside world, which contains a significant amount of CO2. And here's the second reason why I needed so much water. I needed to submerge a small pump. The pump stops a film from forming on the surface of the water and helps to encourage evaporation. I also added a heater to make sure the temperature stayed stable and to encourage further evaporation. At this point, all I could do was hope that I'd created a functioning greenhouse that would keep my plants moist. And it did. But there's one thing I got wrong. In transporting the scape from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, I think I let some of the plants get too cold, and many of them went into shock. In this close-up, you can see that many of the leaves in my carpet have died. It's hard to know what effect that had on the judging, but it was the one blemish in a tank design that came together perfectly, and I couldn't be more proud. The final thing I want to talk about in the scape are the fish. Now, I mentioned Rachel O'Leary earlier in this video in regards to the rocks and the tank she lent me, but she also provided me with these wonderful fish. They're Lamchop rasbora. Now, Rachel is going to call them by their scientific name, but I'm afraid of mispronouncing that, so you'll have to go to her video to find out what they are. I chose these fish because they mimic the scape. Their red-orange hue matches the rocks, and the black patch on these fish mimics the vertical structure in the center of the tank. Next time, these exact same fish will be in a totally different scape. I'll be showing you a competition tank I set up 6 months ago, and we'll see how it progressed.